Hey guys, Liana here. By the time we're watching this, it will be 2 days after the first Democratic debate, uh, primary debate, Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, and all. And I wanted to talk about one topic because it's connected to um, things that happen in gaming about causes of real life violence. This came up, and as you can see the headline, it was the only time mental health was discussed during the Democratic debate. And so I want to sort of unpack that and deal with it, because one of the things that gravely concerns me in connection to real life issues in video games is people go based on popular opinion and not actually based on facts and the best science we have available. And that's very dangerous. I think it persecutes and discriminates against artists unfairly. And I think that this is a knee-jerk reaction that we have to stop. Just because something's popular doesn't mean it's right. And so I want to take this issue as an example of an instance that has nothing to do with video games, so we can remove those inherent biases everybody has on that topic, and look at something else that's a similar, I'll call it a mechanic, at play. I have a clip I want you to watch. Hopefully the audio's okay. This is the part of the debate in question. The topic is gun violence, and this was a back and forth, a disagreement between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. Now, I want you to watch how Bernie Sanders pivots on the question. This is what's brought this whole issue into focus. Okay, ready? Here we go.
A consensus in this country. A consensus that said we need to strengthen and expand instant background checks, do away with this gun show loophole, that we have to address the issue of mental health, that we have to deal with the straw man purchasing issue, Senator, and that when we develop that consensus, Senator, we can finally do something.
Okay, so there's the clip right there. And okay, so you notice that Bernie Sanders referenced consensus, not actually science. This is consensus of opinion. And this is what I want to talk about there's a massive difference. My background in this is the moral panic that rose around video games after the Columbine high school shootings, and I want to believe, 1999. You'll notice that influenced by violent video games came up, specifically the game Doom. And you'll see that this says none of these theories was ever proven, but the idea that violent video games somehow cause violent behavior persists in popular opinion, despite science finding that video games, lead to a temporary increase in aggression, but not violence. So we gamers are very, very aware of the stigma that can be created and the bad decisions that can be created when popular opinion diverges from the actual science on an issue. As recently as 2013, almost 46% of respondents to a national survey said that people with mental illness were more dangerous than other people. Scientifically false, except in cases of a few extreme mental illness. The problem is mental illness is everything from depression to paranoid delusional schizophrenia. Right? It's a big tent. According to two recent Gallup polls from 2011-2013, more people believe that mass shootings result from a failure of the mental health system than from easy access to guns. 80% of the population believes that mental illness is at least partially to blame for such incidents. So here's the actual science in comparison to public opinion. 10,000 individuals, more than 10,000 individuals. So those survey nerds out there will be very happy with the sample size. And they were both mentally ill and healthy. And they were studied over the course of 1 year. And the scientists found that serious mental illness alone was a risk factor for violence, from minor incidents like shoving to armed assault, in only 4% of cases. 4%. That is, if you took all the incidents of violence reported among the people in the survey, mental illness alone could only explain 4% of the incidents. And we're talking just mild shoving, okay? Shoving is considered violence in this case. 4%. 4%. When Swanson broke down the samples by demographics, he found that the occurrence of violence was more closely associated with whether someone was male, poor, and abusing either alcohol or drugs, and that those three factors alone could predict violent behavior with or without any sign of mental illness. If someone fit all three of those categories, the likelihood of them committing a violent act was high, even if they weren't also mentally ill. Now, I'm sure people are already going, because gender was brought up. Okay? Chill. Breathe. Pretend it's Mountain Monday. Okay? Chill. This is data. This is not a causal link, and I will get to my theories on this in a bit, because these things are a better start than popular opinion, but they don't say why these things are factors. Okay? More recently, another theory has come out as to why America is prone to mass shootings. Because looking at violence alone, when it comes to these school shootings or spree killings or mass shootings, it's not the same type of crime as overall violence, and this is significant because if you see here, overall violent crime rates are down, but active shooter events, that means a person trying to kill multiple people in a populated area, appear to be on the rise, okay? So we have a divergence. We can't just look at all violence the way that mental illness study does. What this article suggests, based on sciences, is that you'll see here, although the United States is about 5% of the world's population, the country has 31% of the world's mass shooters. The reasons for these numbers are complex, researchers say, but the data suggests that the availability of guns and perhaps the American obsession with fame may be to blame. Now, this is interesting. The United States has more private gun ownership and more desire for fame than any country in the world. Now, the interesting thing that this study also found was that there was no correlation between rate of mass shootings and the overall homicide rate. So living in a safe country or peaceful country is not a predictor to mass shootings. Overall violent crime in the United States dropped 14.5% between 2004 and 2013. Now, what the people doing this study suggested is that it's an attitudinal shift about guns more than the gun ownership itself that is something that can be treated as they call it, a public health problem. Okay, so gun advocates, nobody's saying we're going to take your guns away, okay, because hear me out. Attitudes towards guns have already shifted. There was a time where guns were thought of primarily as tools for hunting and recreation. Increasingly, however, the conversation has shifted to gun use for defense, to stand your ground laws and the right to carry guns openly in public. That's a change in social norms that has occurred. Public health campaigns could seek to push back, encouraging people to think of guns as recreational, not as something meant to be used against one another. I think that's a good idea. That means people can keep their guns, and we can try to change this culture using guns to solve problems. I know gun owners. Contrary to popular belief, Canada is not a gun-free country. Lots of people, especially in rural areas, have what we call long guns, meaning rifles. And the tricky position that Bernie Sanders was in is he's a senator from Vermont, which has a very high rate of gun ownership. Now, the people in Vermont I know, hi folks, use their guns to scare off bears as opposed to using them against people. So there's a good example of people who have a different attitudinal opinion towards guns. Now, here we tie back into this fame idea, and we go back to, you see Columbine being referenced again. And that's why I'm concerned about this discussion, because of the attempted link between the Columbine shooters and and video games. We know a lot of public mass shooters, particularly when they're young, have admitted that they really want to be famous and that killing is how they're going to do it. You can go through this article and look up the way media has changed, the way celebrities get more attention for bad behavior than their work now. This is very interesting. I'm not claiming this is the final word. It's just an interesting study. And, you don't hear about these alternate theories when it comes to gun violence. We're stuck in this paradigm of take away guns or mental health. Before we get to the actual causes that people who research violence have found, because I want you to see what people actually think causes violence, because the whole purpose of this video is to show the difference between the quote-unquote consensus on gun violence and the realities of what causes gun violence, because they don't match. Okay, this was done by Alfred University. It studied students, and they found the number one reason students said people committed school shootings is they want to get back at those who've hurt them, followed by other kids pick on them. They don't value life. They've been victims of physical abuse at home. They have mental problems. It's easy for them to get a gun. They do not get along with their parents. Jump down to here, number 11. They see violence on TV and movies and videos and in computer and video games. I found also interesting about this study is the way they listed the divergence based on, they broke it down by a few things. Amount of media use, race, ethnic background, degree of alienation of the students asked. And what they found was across every variable except race, there were wide difference in students' ideas about media violence as a reason for school shootings. These are very interesting variations. 41% of girls said it was a cause compared to 33% of boys. Students whose grades were mostly D's and F's were far more likely to see it as a problem than those who received mostly B's and C's. So that means people who got poorer grades saw violence in media as a greater problem than people who were better in school. Respondents with a low quality of life index perceived violence in media as less of a problem than those with a high quality of life. Low media users endorse violence in the media as a cause for school shootings at a significantly higher rate than those who are high media users. So the more you use it, the less likely you are to consider it a problem. And now, to be clear, none of the people in these studies have committed crimes, I believe. Highly alienated respondents were considerably less likely to see it as a problem than those with low alienation. Those from neighborhoods with more crime were more likely to say violence in the media is a problem than those who come from neighborhoods where there were a lot of crime. 40% of the respondents who say they don't feel safe in school blamed violence in the media, compared to 37% of those who said their schools are extremely safe or very safe, and 34% of those who said their schools are safe. So the people that had kind of the least to worry about felt you've got people in safe neighborhoods saying there's problems of violence in the media, and then you get people who say they don't feel safe at school. 40% of rural residents and 39% of urban students agreed it is a problem, compared to 34% of suburban residents. I wonder how many of those rural residents overlap with the people who don't feel safe in school, because the percentage is identical. Those who live in the Midwest and South were more likely to view media violence as a cause than those who live in the East or West. And respondents whose mothers had a high school education or less were more likely to blame violence in the media than those whose mothers have a college degree. So basically, if you get better grades, use a lot of media, and live in an unsafe neighborhood but feel relatively safe at school and are male, you're less likely to see violence in the media as a reason for school shootings. I found that gender difference very, very interesting, because I go against that gap. Now, you'll still see a minority of women said it was a cause. So where am I going with this? Well, now I'm going to get to what the experts say are the actual causes of violent crime. And this goes back to, remember I said I'd hold that thought about the identification as male. Here we go. This article comes from Pacific Standard Magazine. It's a conversation with a professor in psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Duke University School of Medicine, one of the leading researchers on mental health and violence. Okay, so here we go. Let's dig in. I recommend you read this whole article, but for the purposes of time, we're going to jump right to the spot that's relevant to us. The first thing he said was the risk factors for a mass shooting are shared by a lot of people who aren't going to do it. If you paint the picture of a young, isolated, delusional young man, that probably describes thousands of other young men. And then it's a study looks specifically at 34 adolescent mass murderers, all male. 70% were described as a loner, 61.5% had problems with substance abuse, 48% had preoccupations with weapons, 43.5% had been victims of bullying. Only 23% had a documented psychiatric history of any kind, which means 3 out of 4 did not. Now, here's that caveat to the mental illness thing I was talking about earlier. People with serious mental illness are 3 to 4 times more likely to be violent than those who aren't. Now, that's still fairly low because the majority of people aren't violent. But the vast majority of people with mental illness are not violent and never will be. So what are these serious mental illnesses they're talking about? They referenced schizophrenia as one. Otherwise, they don't say. And here's this thing. Most violence in society is caused by other things. Let me repeat. Most violence in society is caused by other things, not mental illness. Even if we had a perfect mental health care system, that's not going to solve our gun violence problem. If we were magically able to cure schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and major depression, that would be wonderful, but overall violence would go down by only about 4%. That's all violence, not just school shootings. 4%. And what's the problem with unfairly tagging mental illness as a reason for shootings? Well, this idea that people with a mental illness shouldn't be able to own guns. Well, for instance, think about someone who had a suicidal mental health crisis 25 years ago, was involuntarily hospitalized, but now they're recovered and fine. They haven't had problems in years. They want to get a job as a security guard, and they can't because they can't possess firearms. Now, this is going to reduce people's willingness to seek help, and that's an issue. So they talk about background checks, all this stuff. In last year, this was done in 2014. They haven't done a lot of research whether background checks really make a huge difference. But this line after that is very interesting. And this is what I think fuels the Bernie Sanders quote because of the way he framed it. Okay. When one of these mass shootings has occurred, there's immediately a lot of attention and finger pointing. Mental health becomes the 1 square inch of common real estate between people who want to reform the mental health care system and the gun rights people. So you have 2 lobbies in agreement. When you have that agreement, that's consensus and you get things done. But is it the right solution? Well, this article claims that a better policy would focus on behavioral indicators of risk, not so much on mental health and mental illness as a category, because when we talked about before, mental illness is a very, very big tent. Just because somebody thinks, and this is an exaggeration, but just because someone thinks they're a chicken does not mean they're going to go out and commit violence. So here's that thing where I talked about the risk factors and how identifying men as, more, one of those things that's the correlation. It doesn't necessarily have to do with gender specifically, like there's nothing inherently problematic about being male. Here's where we dig down into that. You see, this violence is not distributed at random. If you look at the victims of homicide, for instance, young African American men are far more likely to be victims of homicide. We need to think of violence itself as a communicable disease. We have kids. We did a study some years ago looking at violence risk among people with serious mental illness. The 3 risk factors we found were most important. First, a history of violent victimization early in life. Second, substance abuse. And the third is exposure to violence in the environment around you. People who had none of those risk factors, even with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, had very low rates of violent behavior. Now, how does this connect to masculinity? Well, this is a Canadian government website. It's a little bit older than the other stuff. I'm sorry, it's much harder to find stuff about male victims of violent crime, but yay, Canada, we did it. Let's look at the numbers. And remember, we're talking about that indicator of maleness being a precursor for a potential precursor for a link to mass shootings, okay? And then that connection to the actual scientific breakdown of the reasons for crime, okay? Overall rates of police reported violent victimization were comparable between men and women, but the nature of their victimization differed. Men were more likely than women to be victims of the most serious forms of physical assault or to have a weapon used against. The rate of aggravated assault for men is over 3 times greater than that of women. Young men under the age of 18 are 1.5 times more likely to be physically assaulted than young girls. Male victims were most often physically assaulted by a stranger or by someone else outside of the family. Men were the victims of 80% of all reported attacks by strangers. They were the victims of 65% of robberies. They were more likely than women to be a homicide victim. Almost 3/4 of homicide victims. 1/3 of male victims of homicide were killed by a firearm compared to 1/5 of female homicide victims. And men were 2.5 times more likely to be sexually assaulted in an institutional setting, a school, non-commercial or non-corporate area, than women. So when we connect the risk factor of being male with a link to a history of violence, victimization early in life, and exposure to violence in the environment, we find out that the risk factor of violent victimization and exposure to violence in the environment are more likely to be for men. And so this indicator, this masculinity indicator, may actually be masking 2 other risk factors, which is violent victimization early in life and violence in the environment around you. And then substance abuse is also more likely to be male. Don't take my word for it. Here you go. More males than females abuse prescription drugs in all age groups except the youngest. And we can go on and on. There's just a little bit of data. I don't want you to just take my word for it. There you go. And this is why it's important to look at gender, but not just look at gender. And this is something I hope that I've made clear in my ongoing work. It's one thing that most spree killers, most mass killers, I forget what they call active shooters, are male. But that doesn't mean that there's something inherently wrong with being a man. It's what happens to men in our society that is probably, the 3 main risk factors identified are all more likely to happen to men. There we go. It makes sense, doesn't it? Now, why does this matter? Okay, there's more to it than this, right? We've been talking about homicides and massive things like that, but I want to end on something that I think that this mental health awareness and this sort of gendered awareness of mental health, but in a compassionate, reasonable way, can actually link to something else that actually solve a problem. And so this, what he says, back of the envelope calculation means it's quick. This isn't scientific, just it's making a point. If you were to back out all the risk associated with mental illness that's contributing to the 300,000 people killed by gunshot wounds in the last 10 years, you could probably reduce deaths by about 100,000 people. 95% of the reduction would be from suicide. Only 5% would be from reducing homicide. Mental illness is a strong risk factor for suicide. It's not a strong risk factor for homicide. And again, who's the most likely group to die by suicide involving guns? Men. And It says suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. Lots of times it's the impulsive action of a young person who's intoxicated. There's a huge possibility to prevent it. If a person survives a suicide attempt, there's good evidence they're unlikely to go and die from another suicide. But the fatality rate for gun suicides attempt is just huge. So we have something. We have a healthcare issue, which is suicide, predominantly affecting men. And it just is. Sorry. And I think, we can kind of link as to why. More likely to be victims of violent crime, more addiction. I mean, if we drill down how much of these increased risk factors is connected to what happens to men when we're young because of what men are expected to take from, other men, but also from women sometimes. And this is why I think it's important to examine gender because, look, I'm a gender theorist, so I can see this stuff. I can go, yeah, there are things that affect women more than men. There are things that affect men more than women. And this is why I don't like calling women's studies programs women's studies. I think they should be gender studies and teach people both genders, because if you're only teaching one half, it's like walking around with one eye covered. It's silly. And we do have a gender binary that impacts men negatively and women negatively in different ways, but it's undeniable that it does affect negatively both men and women. And so, one of the things we can really do to save lives when it comes to masculinity and guns is, you can see it right here. I have colleagues who are psychiatrists. When they see patients with serious depression, they counsel them about the danger of having a gun in the house. They have a conversation with family members. You can do a lot without invoking law by talking to people about harm reduction and locking up guns. I have a friend who's still alive because an assistant of his had the wherewithal to remove the firing pin from his sidearm. If she hadn't, he would have blown his own head off. And I think we need to pivot the mental health and gun debate and the debate around the link towards, video games and violence and aggression and all that stuff. I think we need to pivot it away from the homicide debate and into the suicide discussion, because it will save a lot more lives. I think that it's much easier to prevent a suicide than a school shooting. Perhaps we'll be able to catch some in the same net. But if we want to have a discussion about access to guns and mental illness, I think that talking about suicide is a more natural place to start. It's something we can get far greater ground covered on much more quickly and much more cheaply. And perhaps in doing so, we'll be able to address some of these societal problems and risk factors affecting men. And women, I'm going to take a feminist pivot on this. We have a role to play in this. It's very important that when you're talking to men, you don't fall prey to the sort of stereotypical thinking that men are naturally tougher than we are. Men are not inherently tougher than women emotionally. They hide their emotions a lot more than we do because they've been socially trained to. But some of the biggest pressures in a man's life involving masculinity come from the women around them. They're starting to call it white horse syndrome. But we can do a lot. We can do a lot by not having the expectation that the men in our lives always be in emotional control. And this is especially true of those of us that have had bad experiences in our pasts. It's very hard not to be scared sometimes when, you've had bad experiences and you see someone lose their temper, and all these warning bells go off in your head and you default to those scripts. But it's also important that you check in and ask the men in your lives, ladies, are you okay? And they may not tell you at first. They may even react defensively because of the way they're trained. But if they don't want to talk, they don't want to talk, but you asked. And then, do it again. Are you okay? And you don't necessarily have to wait until you notice something. Sometimes it's better to sort of do it and normalize it when things are kind of on an even keel. But when there is something definitely different, when you see them acting strangely, instead of nagging them that they haven't done a household chore, ask them if they're okay. Check in and make sure that emotional stability is there, because that not taking out the garbage, not fixing the toilet, or not folding the laundry may be because they're suffering from depression or something's gone badly, and not just, that stereotypical, oh, you're being lazy, whatever. Our society is very tough on men in ways that are unique to the way it's tough on women. And I think we're only starting to deal with that because, I mean, these situations have lasted for a long, long time, right? The suicide statistics have not changed very much over time. I think it's just becoming to a point that we can actually start looking at it and start coming together, as men and women. And I know, you know, um, there's that other gender category, but for the purposes of this, let's just keep it simple, please. No cis-normative intended, just simplicity. Um, we sacrifice the assumption that men are caring people because there's this social assumption that men are the more reasonable gender, and this is going right back to Victorian times, the rationalist movement, the romantic movement, things like that. Women are creatures of emotion, men are creatures of reason. It's all through Sherlock Holmes. And that's kind of garbage in my experience. Like, I don't have a study on this, but um, just in my anecdotal experience, I've had the fortune, shall we say, the privilege to be able to talk to a lot of men and women about very, very sensitive, tender things. And I've been able to see sort of the internal workings of men more because I am a gamer. And so, because we have that shared thing, because the wall comes down, because I'm not so much of that judgmental other, because I'm like, man, Gears of War and God of War are badass. Basically, anything that has of war in it, Dawn of War, Gears of War, God of War, I'm there, man. I like my violent video games, and I think that sort of breaks the ice and establishes a comfort zone. And guys tell me sensitive personal stuff. They talk about their pains. They talk about the fact that they're hurting. And I'm an introverted person. I have trouble expressing my feelings sometimes myself. And so I've learned that I have to make a conscious effort to say, what happened to you sucked. And like, look, I see that hurt, and I am not minimizing that hurt. What happened to you was bad. And, you know, I feel very, I use the word blessed instead of privileged, but I feel very fortunate that I've been able to see guys in that way, to see men in that way, to see the wall come down, and to see that vulnerability, because to me, I I respect guys more after things like that. I respect someone who can ask for help a lot, no matter what gender they are. And I think that if we were more open to people, we wouldn't have these societal traps of violence where violence breeds violence and it's a cycle, and we don't start giving a shit until someone goes and kills 12 people in a public place. And, do I believe we need to improve mental health? Yes. But if we're going to talk about mental health in the sphere of guns, we need to address the suicide issue and not just frame it in the myth of inherent male aggression, in this idea that the stereotype is a man with a gun is a would-be killer, as opposed to a man with a gun is somebody who might blow his own head off more likely than he'll kill anybody else. And I think if we do that, it'll be a big step to solving this issue, because we save lives right away. First of all, we save lives right away on a community level without 1 cent needing to be spent on a program if we all just start looking at our friends and families and making sure they're all right. And I think gaming can be a big part of this because, like I said, gaming brings the walls down. It's a shared activity. We can have these conversations, and the demonization of video games and politics and the media and all this stuff is getting in the way of the way video games can build bridges between men and men and women and women and women, because all that stuff matters a lot less when you're playing the same game, because then you become teammates, and team dynamics are a great way of overcoming a lot of barriers in terms of identity politics, and I think that can't be said enough.